All right, so this is one of the tougher lectures because now, like when we've done this whole introduction, we've talked about the one story, we've talked about the grace in the Old Testament, we've talked about Christ in the Old Testament, not necessarily just in the prophecies, but also where he appeared and where does he fit in with the feasts. So now we've got three kind of tougher lectures. Now we're going to talk about the challenges in the Old Testament. Tonight we're going to talk about the evolution, the whole problem with evolution, and the problem of Genesis 1 to 2, and how does that fit into evolution. And then tomorrow we're going to start talking about more of the other challenges that we talk about: slavery, the Canaanite War, women, the law, and how to look all of this in the Old Testament in the context of the 21st century. So part of this lecture you guys have heard last time when I was here in June, but now I'm going to expand on it a little bit more and go into details. And I want to preface by saying something that today, my role is not to give you an answer to what is the best interpretation of Genesis when it comes to evolution. But what I want to tell you is that there are actually so many different interpretations of Genesis, all within the church, in terms of a sense of Orthodox, Catholic, and Protestant. So I can't really say, well, this is, heretical views. Some views and some arguments are weaker than others. Others are stronger, okay? But you can't say, well, this is a heresy, because the people are reading the same text. It's not like they're reading a different text. In general, when I tackle this topic of evolution and Genesis, I always tell people, you know what? In essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. There should be a little bit of freedom, okay, in how you interpret. And in all things, charity. Because for us, trust me when I tell you, this is becoming a major issue, although, within the last, 10, 20 years, it's definitely gotten more heated up as people are starting to read for Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Hitchens and all that, because there is some sort of conflict. There appears to be a bit of a conflict, and it's kind of an apparent conflict between science and religion, faith and science. Although this is put out of context with a lot of the media coverage, but definitely it is a real factor. The other thing which I look at, which is really interesting, and this is a Gallup poll that was done in the United States. But when you see over here in this side, humans evolved where God had no part in the process. So this is basically saying that, God did nothing whatsoever in man coming out. You see in high school, okay, here this figure, in high school, 11% believe that God had nothing to do with it. And then as they finish their college education, a threefold increase. Okay, so there's something about college education. When you look at even the percentage of people that God created humans in the last 10,000 years, okay, it's very interesting when you look at this percentage. So half of the high school kids believe that God created them as is in the last 10,000 years. When they're done with their college education, it kind of cuts in half, which is really a very, very interesting transition as colleges go. And by the way, this was a poll for U.S. universities. But actually, when you take some selective U.S. universities like in East Coast and West Coast, this percentage is even higher. Okay, when you take this poll in scientists and elite scientists, this percentage could be almost up to 100% don't believe that God had anything to do with man and his evolution. The question is that, are we really under attack? And you find kind of a quote from Richard Dawkins, and basically Dawkins, who is the quote-unquote pope of that movement, he mentioned when he said, that his aim, his goal is to levy an intense barrage of ridicule. It's to bully them, okay? And at the religious moderates, to bully them into surrendering to atheism. I think that the fence sitters, those who are on the fence, those who are can't decide, those who are a little bit, unsure about the nature of the debate, are likely to be swayed by a display of naked contempt. That is actually very harsh. To come from a scientist, I can see this coming on from a political, rally. I can see this coming up from Donald Trump. Okay, but to come from a scientist who I would say in an argument, what kind of argument are you using? Are you using a rational argument, or are you just using contempt? Okay, so to come out from an Oxford professor, I find that actually sometimes hard to believe. But if that tells you anything, tells you how sometimes these debates cross the line of logic and rationalism. Okay, it's irrational at this point. It is kind of a bullying. Why is this also a major issue? Because the problem, it is an area where there's new discoveries every day. So we can have this argument today about science, and today I'm going to talk actually about the Bible, not about science. I've got a full another lecture about science, okay? But when you talk about science, every year the science is advancing. So we can have this discussion now, and then we meet another year, there'll be a completely different set of advancements. And then also when you're looking at this, it's a multidisciplinary area. It's impossible for one person to grasp the whole area of the science. Because you've got biology, you've got genetics, you've got archaeology, you've got paleontology, you've got cosmology, okay? You've got astrophysics. And right now there's a whole new field of economy students who are actually looking into mathematical modeling of, for example, of genetics, and how could this be explained. So the field for just one mind to grasp all this is impossible. So when you actually put this also into the context of the church, okay, this is a very intense debate in the church. It is unbelievable, okay, because then as a person who is well versed in science and you are in the church, here are the areas of the church that you need to be well versed in. You need to be well versed in theology, in biblical studies, in biblical linguistics, in biblical archaeology. You need to even be well versed in ancient Near East studies to understand the context of civilization where this account was written. To tell you how bad this is, a college professor, okay, was forced to resign, okay, because he believed that Adam was not created by an immediate act of God. Like, you know what, God created Adam like in a direct fashion, okay, that evolution could have happened. So he was forced to resign. In fact, this guy, Bruce Waltke, he's the guy who wrote some of the best textbooks about Old Testament theology that exist in this world. He's an amazing theologian, okay? He is the professor of Old Testament theology. Okay? And he was forced to resign because basically he said, I think we need to have an open discussion about evolution and the interpretation of Genesis. And his evangelical seminary told him, you know what? You got to resign. Okay? Even when Pope John Paul, okay, about almost 40 years ago, embraced evolution, that made a whole slew of news in the world. Because at that time, and probably some of you know this very well, the Catholic Church endorses evolution, you know, at its full term. They don't shy away from that. And since the time of John Paul, okay, that was their stance. And you can imagine the amount of rejection and the amount of animosity they would have, for example, with the evangelical side, who believe very much in a literal interpretation of the Bible. So rules of engagement in biological apologetics. It is an area of major complexity. Be gracious and be humble. And something I've got to tell you this, and I'm going to give it to you in a diagram. I truly believe, after I've studied this for so many years, that there is not one acceptable view. This is not the nature of Christ. Let's make it clear, okay? The nature of Christ, the church fought and battled, and they had a council of Nicaea, and they came up, this is the definition of nature of Christ, okay? But when it comes into the biblical interpretation of Genesis, here's how I believe it is. You can look at this interpretation, because here, by the way, we're not talking about different texts. They're all reading the same text. We're talking about interpretation. And when you cross from text to interpretation, there has to be a variation. There has to be a variation. So within this context, if I call this outline here the orthodox way of interpretation of the biblical account of Genesis, okay, you could be here. That is your own view within this camp. And this I call mainstream camps, which are Orthodox, Catholic, and Evangelical. Okay? You might find another person overlaps with you in some parts of it. Parts of the interpretation he's going to overlap with you. You're going to find another that actually is completely different than your interpretation in main things when it comes to evolution and Genesis. But I would tell you that that other is not a heretic. That other is still within this main frame of what's called mainstream Christianity, okay? You will find somebody who's outside, and they will claim that they are Christian. I would tell you today, what I'm trying to give you an idea, what is this outline looking like? So you don't really come to people who are in this area, and you say, well, you know what, you're heretical. So the purpose of this is not to give you one view, but I totally believe in giving you an objective representation of how Christians view evolution and how Christians view Genesis. Okay? And then at the end, honestly, you need to do your own homework and your own way of reading. Because I can't tell you, well, this is the right answer. If I would want to summarize this lecture before I even started, I'll tell you something. Although you will find, and I will give you not less than 5 different viewpoints of interpreting Genesis 1 to 2. And they all have their real strong argument, because these people are not stupid. They've done their homework. Okay? But if all of them, these views differ, they would agree on 3 main things. When you remember when I told you that frame, okay? This is the frame that they all are in. Number 1, that God created all. There's no question about that. There is a transcendental person named God who created all. Number 2, God created all for good, because one of the basic fundamental things of evolution, of Darwinist evolution, is that it's purposeless. Okay? That is the basic, simple, reductionist definition of Darwinistic evolution. It's purposeless. But yet when you look at these Christians, when they look at how God, they would say, well, we're sometimes fine with evolution. There's this whole camp that we'll talk about called theistic evolution. Okay? They would believe 100% in evolution as a biological mechanism. But they would tell you it is still guided for a purpose, for the good of God. So you'll find a scientist, okay, one of the smartest scientists that we have on this earth, and he's the one who was actually nominated. He is the head of NIH, the highest funding agency of research in the world, okay, Francis Collins. He believes in evolution as much as Dawkins believes in evolution from a biological standpoint. But when it comes in the purpose, he would tell you, you know what? It was all created by God, and it was all created by good. And it goes back to the point that it was all created for good, for us to enjoy the relationship. One thing I would add over here is that all Christian camps, that although they may disagree about how to interpret Genesis 1 to 2, they would all agree that it was created from nothing. The universe was not eternal in its existence. Okay? And even now when we talk about how the Big Bang and how the metaphysics of that, even this is being, almost agreed upon with a lot of astrophysicists around the world, that the universe was not eternal in its existence. Okay? So most of them would say that God created it all for good, and God created for us to enjoy the relationship. So these are biblical scholars who work with scientists to try to come up with an explanation of Genesis 1 to 2 and how does it rhyme with evolution. They may disagree with a lot of details, but this is the fine kind of outline that they go all under. So the bottom line is that can we reach an agreement? And the possible answer is probably no. We cannot reach an agreement in how to interpret Genesis 1 to 3, because surprisingly, from the time of the early church and the early church fathers, this was debated. It's not like this is a modern debate. It's actually been there for quite a while. Because now you're going from the beginning of the cosmos, which a lot of people don't deny. In fact, at this point, when you look at cosmologists and the Big Bang, it is to a major extent been accepted as the most prevailing explanation of the beginning of the universe. Okay? So people don't necessarily argue that much. But the question then becomes to the beginning of life, bios, on the earth, to then the beginning of man. The problem, and here's how I try to give it, is that, you know what, to make the best analogy, because this is where people get into a bit of a tough shape. It's as if you're on a rail track, okay? What is a rail track? There are 2 tracks. There's one and there's another one, and they're both parallel, right? If one of them deviates, if one of them makes a bit of an angle, can the train move? No. If one of them deviates, the other one, so the train can move, has to what? Deviate with it. The problem is that you've got 2 tracks. As a believer and as somebody who is in science, you've got 2 tracks you're battling with. The first track is called biblical interpretation. How do you, as a person, as a believer, look at Genesis 1 to 2? How do you read it? And then you've got the other one, which is scientific interpretation. How do you view evolution? Do you believe in evolution completely as is, that all creation, including mankind, evolved from precursors? Or do you believe that, you know what, animals developed from precursors and man was a special creation? So what's your interpretation of the evolutionary material? The reality, when you look at the lay of the land, it's something like this. It's realistic, something like this, okay? Because for every single biblical interpretation, there is a matching scientific. And then you find this mix and match. And all this, by the way, is within the camp of the church. Because it all depends on how you interpret both the Bible and the science. I would tell you something, and I cannot go in the whole lecture of the science. But from the scientific perspective of evolution, and I'll tell you the challenges and I'll summarize it in a very simple sentence. The fossil evidence for evolution of man from prior precursors, or evolution of all creation from prior precursors, is a bit sketchy with many different gaps. That doesn't mean they don't have an answer. That doesn't mean that an answer may not come up in the future, but there are a lot of gaps. However, what I find in an objective sense, and I would make it this very clear, on an objective sense, what I find very compelling for evolution as a explanation, and by the way, when I say evolution, I say of it still as a theory, okay, that it's still being proposed. It is a very strong theory. There's a lot of evidence that point to it, okay? You cannot deny that. I find some of the strongest evidence that points to evolution is the genetic evidence. The genetic evidence is very, very puzzling and compelling in some areas. The problem is that there is no real alternative explanation to why this genetic evidence exists. For example, and I'll give you a very simple thing. When you look at man and chimps, okay, this is just one example to throw it out. This is one of, you know, many examples. When you look at man and chimps, okay, the family of mammals, okay, that are related to man and chimps, they all have a gene that is functional, okay, that makes vitamin C. So mammals, other than man and chimp, don't need to eat fruits and oranges to have vitamin C. Man and chimps, monkeys. Chimps, monkeys. Monkeys, okay? The chimpanzee. So chimpanzee. Okay? But when you find something very interesting, that both man and the chimpanzee, they have in the same spot in the gene, on the same spot, they have the vitamin C gene. They have it. It's not like they don't have it. It's there. And it has a deletion. The same deletion is in man and in the chimpanzee. The same deletion. And you make it like, you know what is this? This is an evidence. It doesn't prove anything, but then you almost have to ask yourself the question, well, you know what, how did this happen? Unless there is a potential, and that's where the theory of evolution comes into play, okay, that whether or not they shared the same ancestor, okay, who had, in that ancestor had this deletion, okay, and then it was transmitted after that to man and chimpanzee. I'm not saying that that is the right explanation, but that's one of the reasons why scientists looking at such evidence feel that the theory of evolution from the genetic standpoint, okay, is becoming very hard to explain otherwise, okay? So from the fossil standpoint, there is a lot of gaps. From the genetic standpoint, is actually becoming stronger. I would tell you that, you know what, they don't have all the answers, but at least we have to respect from a scientific standpoint, okay, that evidence does exist to some extent. So then, when you look at the biological lay of the land, okay, so this is creation versus evolution, okay, so this is the main camps that think in this debate of creation versus evolution. You've got one side over here, which I'm going to just put it out there, is the evolutionist who believes completely in evolution, does not believe in God, does not believe in even in creation. So this is Richard Dawkins' camp, okay? And then on the other side over here, you've got the creationists. And out of those creationists, okay, who believe that God directly intervened to create. Okay, by the way, so all these three are Christians from here till here. Okay, but some of them believe in the direct creation, the direct intervention of God in the creation. Others believe in the indirect creation. You see the difference? So out of the creationists, there is a group called the Young Earth Creationists, and this represents the majority of the main camp of the evangelical church in the United States. Okay, so the evangelical church, almost 50% of them, so this amounts to about millions of Americans, believe it or not. So although you think of the United States as anti-God, there is a huge amount of people in the United States that are young earth creationists. What do they believe in? We'll come to it. But the simple thing is that they believe that the earth, everything that is in it, cannot be more than 10,000 years old. That's why they're called a young earth creationist. How did they get to this? They got to this based on counting the number of years in the genealogy of Genesis 5 and 10. Okay, so when you look at the genealogy, so-and-so lived X years, so-and-so lived X years, they add them up, okay, and they come up with this figure. The old earth creationists are similar, but they believe that the earth itself is old as a universe, so they would believe in the Big Bang, but they believe that man as a creation was created instantaneously, as is 10,000 years ago. So a special creation, okay? And then you've got the intelligent design and the theistic evolution. And those are a little bit overlapping in some way, okay? The main difference, and there is now, which is kind of interesting, the main debate at this point is not, although those two camps are Christians, by the way, they're very, very Christian, okay? The main debate is not between this group or the evolutionists. The main debate is between both of them. So I'll give you some names you might be interested. So theistic evolution, the big names are people like Francis Collins, who's the head of the NIH, which you find like a guy like that, he's head of one of the highest scientific agencies in the world, and he's a professing Christian, okay? But then over here in the intelligent design movement, you get people like William Dembski, Michael Behe, and they've got a lot of productions coming out. The main difference between those two is as follows. Actually, both of them do believe in evolution. Okay? Both of them do believe in evolution. And even to the point, at some instant, the evolution of man from prior ancestors. However, the intelligent design people believe that God intervenes at certain times in this evolution to guide it, okay? And to make it guaranteed to come up to the point that we are in right now as mankind. So God intervenes even though there is a mechanism, but He puts His fingerprint on it during the time period, okay? With what they call special creation, okay? How did they come up with this? Well, they look at certain instances in creation, whether it's genetic or biochemical, and they find structures that have been almost impossible to evolve. Whether it is the eye, whether it is the flagellum, whether it is other things, and they look at this and they try to study how could this have evolved from precursors, okay? And when they find theoretical knowledge that precludes it from evolution, they would say, well, you know what, this potentially is a direct intervention of God. And if you prove that one thing could have been directly created by God as special creation in mankind, in all evolution, then you can say, well, you know, mankind is a special creation. Theistic evolution, these are Christians, but they believe in evolution completely as Richard Dawkins. The only difference between them and Richard Dawkins is the purposefulness, okay? And whether or not it's guided from outside, that God started the process, okay? And let the process move on. But God guided it and God was guaranteeing the outcome. The outcome was not random, because the point of Darwinistic evolution is what? Is the randomness of the outcome. It could happen, it may not happen. Just like a Darwinist would come and say, hey, we're lucky that we exist because we might have not happened to have existed. So the theistic evolution would say, no, the evolution is the mechanism, it explains it, but the initiator and the guiding force for this is God. So this is the biological lay of the land. Now let's move to the biblical lay of the land. And this is where it's going to get into the biblical Genesis account. You find that actually in biblical interpretation. And by the way, as I said, these are biblical camps who are taking the same text of Genesis 1 and 2 and interpreting differently. You find over here, okay, what's called the mythical interpretation. Okay? Okay? This is unfortunately where, like, you know what, atheists and secular movements fall into. They think of the biblical account as just a bunch of mythical stories similar to other stories that have happened. And then you have the historical. And here, when you look at the historical here, they believe as a history that it has happened. Okay? However, when you look at the historical, it's either the language. Look at this. The language. It doesn't mean didn't happen. Historical means That's the difference between historical and mythical. Okay? But either the language is to be literally interpreted, or the language to be figuratively interpreted. Okay? Because even in a figurative interpretation, it does not deny that the instance has happened. It just tells you that the interpretation of that is to be a little bit of a figurative sense. So you find down here is, as you can see over here, the belief in biblical literalism. Okay? You find the young earth creationist. When you go on this side, this is more believing in how literal the account has to be interpreted. You find the young earth creationist, the old earth creationist, and here in the figurative, you find the camps of the ID and the theistic evolution. Okay? And still, as I would tell you, all these are within what we think of mainstream Christian belief. Okay? So you will find within this group the evangelicals, the Catholics, and the Orthodox. I would tell you just from now, right over in this side, you'll find a lot of Catholics and Russian Orthodox. Okay? The Catholic and Russian Orthodox are very much into the figurative movement. The Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Orthodox are a lot of us in terms of the old earth progressive, the progressive creationist, the old earth creationist. Okay? The evangelical, okay, are mainly over here in the young earth creationist. Although actually there are some from the Orthodox Church who would claim more and more to be comfortable with the young earth creationist. So in general, when you look at rules, now we're not talking about science. You know, this conference is about what? About the biblical account and the interpretation of the biblical account. Okay, what are the principles that guide us in this case? Well, number one, you have to figure out what is a genre. Genre is the kind of literature. So you know, for genre, history, a historical account is different than poetry. Okay? A novel is different than what? A biography. Although both of them are what? Stories. Right? But the story could be a novel, which is fiction, or it could be a biography. In poetry, we know very well in poetry, you would use figurative language. You would use a metaphor, a simile, or figurative speech. And you always have to understand this. What is a metaphor or a simile? Okay? Does it denote something that actually happened? Because, for example, I'll give you a very, very famous example. When you say, you know what, this car was flying off the road. This car was flying off the road. What kind of speech is this? Is the car actually flying? No. But what does the fact that you say it was flying off the road denote? Does it denote something that happened historically? Yes. That the car was going what? Very fast. So that's the point of, like, could you consider Genesis 1 and 2 that it is a figurative language that denotes something that in actuality had happened, although it not happened in that literal sense? Okay? Because, for example, you'll find, you know, one of the famous example, okay, the concordism. So when we say that people said that the creators of the heaven who stretches them out, okay, actually the point about God stretched the heavens has been pointed out 17 times in the Bible. Some people jumped on it once actually the Big Bang was discovered and became mainstream. Some people said, hey, this is the Big Bang. But is that really, was really the biblical account, the biblical author who is writing this text really worried about Big Bang and he was trying to prove it? No. Okay, the whole thing about the stretching the universe and creates them out is that the biblical writer is pointing to the expanse, how big it is, and saying this huge universe, God is the one who created it. Can you take this to interpret it, what they call the concordism, to interpret and to actually match your scientific evidence? No. It doesn't make any sense, because that language is a language of figurative speech. The three big problems, as you find in the interpretation, is number one, how to interpret creation ex nihilo. We all know that actually creation, in our Christian sense, is creation ex nihilo. If anyone has seen this, actually this is in, you know, pictures in Washington D.C., which is a sculpture, okay, in a cathedral, of creation out of nothing, where basically this is the matter of nothing, and then God is creating the whole universe out of nothing. It's called creation ex nihilo. Okay, the main thing when you look at actually creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, in the Bible, you find it in a couple of spots. For example, in the Old Testament, you find it in the Maccabees. In the New Testament, we find it in St. Paul's epistles to the Colossians, that he made what is visible out of what is invisible. It didn't even exist. But when you look at Genesis account, does it really tell you in the Genesis account that God created out of nothing? When you actually go by the text in the Genesis account, it's really hard to find that specific part. And that's one of the difficulties. Because did he create out of existing material that he had created prior to that? People are not denying that God created it all from out of nothing. But the Genesis, was that the beginning of from nothing? Or the beginning of pre-existing material that God had created prior to this? The second point is how to interpret the days. Are the days literal or not? And the third one is what to do with man, the creation of man. Because I'll tell you something, within the church interpretation camps, many people would be comfortable assigning evolution towards evolution of plants and of animals. But when it comes to man, man is a special creature. So they would agree with evolution for everything until man. So many things kind of revolve under this man dilemma. So here, when we're going to look at the biblical inerrancy, you've got the literal, the historical context, and the figurative. The literal, which is called the calendar day view, and this basically, their biggest thing is that they're theistic, they believe in God, but they believe in the literal biblical revelation. Which means what? The days of creation are 6 24 hours day. So each day is 24 hours. The sequence of creation as literally mentioned in Genesis 1. The age of the universe based on the calculations, and this actually was started by a guy named Bishop Usher, who was in the United Kingdom, okay, who basically calculated, and he actually came up with that the universe started year 4004 before Christ. How did he come up with this accurate number? Is that he exactly calculated and added the lives of the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 10 and came up with that. But they say, okay, in an average 6,000 to 7,000 years. Adam's creation is a special creation, as is. Ex nihilo, instantaneous, just like that. Created of age means that he was created as an adult man and can be tracked using the genealogies. For them also you have to ask the question, did death exist prior to fall? And they would tell you no for all living beings, including animals and plants. Which, by the way, also kind of makes okay, so how can you have a biological cycle, okay, if animals and plants don't die? What are they feeding on? So they actually vary inside themselves. Some of them say, well, there was death for plants because all the animals were vegetarian, okay, but the animals themselves didn't die, okay. That's their interpretation. I'm not saying that's what's right and what's wrong. I'm just giving you their viewpoint. But then the fall meant a physical and a spiritual death, because Adam spiritually got expelled and physically he died. Prior to that, he was not expected to die and expected to live forever. That is what's called the young earth creationist. What does salvation do? Through one Adam, Jesus Christ, one man, the sin of one man is corrected. What are the strengths of the young earth creationists? So when you look at their viewpoint from the biblical standpoint, okay, what is their strength? Number one, it's the most direct and easily understood meaning of the text. The text says 6 days, you take it as is, it's 6 days. Okay? And that's one of their arguments, to say, you know what, why don't you take the text at a face value? They also ask the question, why would the text, if it's not a limited period, okay, why would the text keep saying, so the evening and the morning of day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4? Because if God, in the biblical inspiration, made it to be written that there was there was the evening and the morning, God was trying to put a defined what? Period. Okay? They say that the Hebrew word yom, which is very similar to our Arabic word yom, when you look at its use in all the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, the majority, there's no question about it, the majority of the Hebrew word yom is interpreted as a 24-hour period. Is it 100% exclusive? No. But at least if you go by majority rule, the majority would tell you, if I am a Hebrew peasant, okay, and I'm illiterate, and I don't know theology, I don't know any of that, and you come and tell me a Hebrew word of yom, I would interpret it as a 24-hour period. So they're saying that if Moses wrote this to the original audience, how did the original audience understand it? And they would say the likelihood the original audience would have understood it in what? As a 24-hour period. And then they say something really interesting, that at the time when God gave the Ten Commandments, okay, that's one of their strong arguments. They say that God in the Ten Commandments, when He gave them 10 Commandments, He told them to put the Sabbath day, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in it, and rested the seventh. Therefore God blessed the Sabbath day, and likewise, you shall work 6 days and rest what? The seventh day. So they're saying if God referred as a model of a week, okay, of 6 days, that the Hebrew worker has to follow to work, that doesn't mean an undefined period. It means what? 6 24-hour periods. They also use the verse of Christ when He said, you know what, are there not 12 hours in the day? Okay, basically saying that, you know what, it's a defined period. And then they really argue and say, you know what, so science right now is showing that the universe is 15 billion years. Maybe in 100 years from now, this whole science is going to be completely nullified, and a new scientific theory is going to come up. If you wed your theology and your biblical interpretation with the current scientific model, you will find that in the next version of science, your biblical understanding is completely what? False. So they have this very interesting term saying a theology wed to the science of one age is a widow in the next. Okay, that if you keep matching, trying to catch up, trying to match your theology to the scientific theories of the day that keep changing, right? You have no theology to stand on. And then they say something that when you look at the Bible also, the Bible said something very much about the plants and the animals, especially that counteracts the idea of evolution, especially macroevolution. And He said, let the earth bring each plant according to its kind. The animals would breed according to their kind. So they would say what this argues against what? Macroevolution. So that's the young earth creationist. Mainly the evangelical camp, as I said, in the United States, they believe in a literal interpretation of the biblical account. What are the challenges of the young earth creationist? What's the weak points in their argument? So what I'm trying to present to you is the strong points in the argument, and then the weak points in the argument. Number one, if we think of a 24-hour period that is conditioned by the presence of the sun, how were there days when there was no sun until the fourth day? We're not saying, by the way, here, how is there light? Because they would come and say that, you know what, the light, there are other sources of light in the universe other than the sun. Okay? You've got cosmic radiation, you've got cosmic explosions, and that could be a source of light in the first, 3 days. But here I'm asking a different question. I'm not asking what's the source of the light in the first 3 days. I'm asking what is the source of the 24 hours, because we know that the 24 hours, okay, are conditioned by revolving the earth on its own axis, right? But that revolving on its own axis is conditioned by also its relationship with the sun. So you can't have a 24-hour as a period without the existence of the sun. There's also another challenge of that. In Genesis 1:11, when you look at actually the exact text, it doesn't say, let there be plants. It doesn't say, let there be plants. Look at the text. Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb that yields seed, and the fruit tree that yields fruit according to its kind. And people who challenge the young earth creationist as a 24-hour interpretation would say, any farmer, even the Jewish farmer who is in the middle of the 10th century before Christ, reading this, would tell you that a plant to grow from the earth takes time, right? That it's not only going to happen in 24 hours. So, because here it's saying, let the earth bring forth. So it's given to the earth the ability to grow the seed, and that would not happen in 24 hours. So that's one of the challenges they offer, that this could not be a literal interpretation of 24 hours. another question that comes up also as a challenge of the young earth creationist. When you look at the creation accounts, you find that there are two stories, okay? There is Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2. They complement each other. But then you find in Genesis 2 a very interesting thing. In day 6, there is a lot of things that happen in day 6. Because who was created in day 6? The animals, Adam, and Eve, right? According to Genesis 1, the animals and Adam and Eve in day 6. But then when you read in Genesis 2, day 6 tells you that God created Adam and he brought for Adam all the animals so he would name them. Okay? And then after that, he created Eve from Adam. And anyone would say, well, you know what, if you're taking it from a literal standpoint, okay, because I'm using your same argument. You want to interpret it literally? I'm going to interpret it literally. How would Adam be able to accomplish such a task, and yet even Eve would be created from him in a 24-hour period? It's just not doable. Another argument that they would say is that although the majority of the word yom in the Old Testament is interpreted as 24-hour period, yet it's not exclusive. Because it's not only to be interpreted in 24-hour period. In fact, we talk about it right now. We say in the day of the king so-and-so. So what are we referring to? Only a 24-hour period? Or referring to a period of time? Because even in the same text, okay, when you look at Genesis 2:4, it says, in the day the Lord created heavens and earth. And that's talking about a period. So even within that same text, okay, it becomes hard to say that Yom is only 24 hours. They answer the Exodus, okay, where they answer the seventh day. So the seventh day is referred to Yom, but we know it doesn't have an end. Because God rested on the seventh day. Did the seventh day end? No. So why would you accept that a seventh day would be referred to as Yom, as an open-ended period, but would not accept the same argument on the first 6 days? One of the last challenges, which is kind of very interesting, they always say the question, when Adam was created according to the young earth creationist, okay, when Adam was created according to the young earth creationist, was he created as an adult man? Yes. So when he's created as an adult man, he was like, let's say 25 years old. So what is his actual age? Is it 25 years? Or is it literally 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, if he was just created? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense. So you know what their answer is to this? It's a very interesting answer, which I don't know if it's biblically and theologically valid, but that's how they answer it. Which is what we call the creation of the appearance of age. Yes, God is almighty, can do everything. Okay? But they would ask the question and they say, you know what? When Christ was turning the water into wine in the wedding of Cana of Galilee, okay? When he turned it into wine, that wine, was it fresh wine or of age? It was of age. Yet it was turned right there. And yet when people drank it, they had the taste of age. So they, in their theology, and this is as I'm telling you, the evangelical group, they say like Christ was able to turn the wine just like this instantaneously, and it did taste of age. God created Adam just like this, and he looked like a 25-year-old man. Why do they use this interpretation? Because they don't apply this only to Adam. They apply this to the whole universe. Because once somebody would come and ask them, well, why does the universe, when the Big Bang and the background radiation, it gives us the appearance, at least scientifically, that it's 15 billion years? Well, they would say God created with the appearance of 15 billion years, but truly, it's only 10,000 years. And you would say, well, why would God do that? And that's an answer, that's a question they don't really have an answer to. So, similar to the wine of Cana of Galilee, an Adam created of age, that he appears as 25, but he's literally just a couple minutes old, the universe could appear that it is 15 billion years, but it's only 10,000 years, according to the biblical account. Yet it appears of age. But it almost puts God into like this cosmic trickster, if I may say. So then the second group, which is called the historical context. Yes, and that's actually the group where with William Lane Craig, one of the most famous apologists, amazing guy. And I think one of the reasons he's very, very good, that he's moderate. He's moderate. And I actually would say I'd like to be in his camp because he really is a very moderate guy. But those basically, they look at what's called context, not literal, but context. And they look at the whole context like, okay, we know right now from a lot of scientific data that the universe is old. So how can you put this into the context of the biblical interpretation? And very quickly, without actually going details, there is a lot of theories behind this. And as I said, these are theories of interpretation of the Bible. I'm not saying this is the right interpretation. Okay? But one of them, which is called the gap theory, basically says that on Genesis 1:1, God made everything. All creation was made. Okay? And then this was the beginning of time. And then from Genesis 1:1, it says actually in Genesis 1:2, okay, and the earth was without form and void. وَكَانَتِ الْأَرْضِ خَرِبًا. Okay? So they look at this, that this time is the billions of years that we look at in the scientific age. And then in the more modern time, so about 10,000 years, Genesis 1:3 picked up. And God put back the creation back to the 6 days. So it is 24-hour days after a gap between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:2. The age of the universe is billions of years. Adam is still a special creation and instantaneous ex nihilo. So that's the gap theory. The one after it, it's called the day-age theory. And this guy is an astrophysicist. He believes in that Genesis 1:1, beginning of creation, and then the creation was on 6 undefined periods of time that could be overlapping. They could be overlapping between each other. So this guy's name is Hugh Ross. He's a very, very famous Christian astrophysicist. And he looks like, those could be billions of years. It took a long time. And on the 7th day, God rested. So there's 6 periods of prolonged time, not limited to 24-hour periods. The sequence is not necessarily literal, but they could overlap. The days could overlap. So day 1 is against day 2, they could overlap. It is billions of years. For him, death did exist for animals because they think, the animals, as a biological creation, okay, they have to go through the biological cycle. The animals are not going to live eternally. But for man, death did not exist until fall came. The challenges for the day-age creation is that, even if the day ages are correct, it doesn't match the sequence of how the universe came into play. Because you look over here, the earth is before the sun. And that's actually what we know from science is not the case. Because the sun is far older than the earth. So if you're trying to match it up, it doesn't match. You see what I'm saying? The vegetation is before marine creatures. Anyone who's studied evolution tells you that the marine creatures happen before the vegetations. So are you trying to force a scientific theory too much into the Bible? Okay, and trying to line them up. And maybe that's not the right way to look at it. Another one thing is that, the overlapping is that although it makes sense from biology, but how are you going to take it with the biblical account, so the evening and so the morning of the day 1, 2, 3? The day gap, which is a version of it, is like, that these God created on 24 hours, and between them there are gaps, a prolonged period of time to match these billions of years. I want to get into actually this one, because this one actually is the most now compelling theory in biology at this point in theistic evolution. So this guy, his name is Francis Collins. He's the head of the NIH in New York, in Washington. And he believes totally in evolution. Okay? And when you look at him and believing in evolution, you ask him, so how do you interpret the Bible? How do you interpret the Bible? So when he looks at it, he looks at the concept of the week. It's a framework. It's a framework. That within this framework, it's a logical and topical framework of creation at that point. The age of the universe is billions of years. Adam could be a special creation, but he could be also created through the natural way of evolution. Death did not exist for man before fall. The reality is that when you look at something as the historical figurative, they tell you that creation, according to the ancient narrative, they try to compare with the ancient Near East. When you look at the myth, in the Babylonian myth, the Assyrian myth, creation at that time was not necessarily meant to be read literally, but meant to be read in terms of a context. And when it's read as a context, okay, God created man, that is the moral of the story. So you don't need to go into details. You look at it as the framework of what is being given. And at the end, okay, God meets man in the Garden of Eden as the point of that relationship. So here he is looking at those as a function. God gave the function to mankind. God gave the function to the earth to produce food. God gave the function to the air to produce rain. God gave the function to man to be the king of the earth. But in terms of the creation as is, that was not the purpose of the creation. So that's what they call it, the historical figurative. That definitely is a very, very liberal interpretation of the story. The problem is that it's very appealing to biology in terms of standpoint of creation. Why? Because it matches evolution very much. It matches evolution. Except the problem is that where is Adam and where is Eve? Are Adam and Eve historical figures? In the historical figurative, Adam and Eve represent all of us, which is the problem of the Catholic Church. When you look at actually the Catholic Church, how they interpret this, some of the Catholic theologians don't even believe in the existence of a Adam and an Eve. But that's very problematic, because then when you look into Romans 5, it says through one man, Adam, sin entered. If this one man does not exist, then Paul got it completely wrong. You look at what is death. If human beings evolved from precursor ancestors, you have to assume that they died before sin. So then the theology of how sin came becomes really hard at that point. So when you look at this lay of the land, and I want to go back at it, okay, to end and give you this picture again, you would find that it is really hard to put it together. But as a church, you could either interpret it literally and be a young earth creationist when you look at it as 24 hours, or you can interpret it figuratively, completely, where the story becomes to you a figurative speech. In this figurative speech, you have a lot more leeway to fit into it the theory of evolution. But have you lost some biblical principles in that case? And I think the answer is yes. I think you don't have a good defense and a good definition of who's Adam, who's Eve. I think you have a very, very tough definition defining what is sin, what has sin done to us, what is death. Has death existed prior to sin? Because in the figurative model, death would have existed prior to us sinning. You even ask the question, what was sin at that point? I do believe that in the middle there, which is where somebody like William Lane Craig would fall, he would believe in evolution of plants. He would believe in evolution of animals, even to the point of maybe macroevolution of animals, although that evidence may be still wanting. But when it comes to mankind, because of the image of God, it is a special instantaneous creation at that point. Because that's the point when the relationship starts. Because then sin becomes a rejection of that relationship, and that's when death comes into play. Then you can ask him the question, which I'm sure one of you is going to ask, well, what about the creatures, the intelligent creatures, the caveman, the hominids, the Neanderthals, who existed 70, 80,000 years ago? Are these considered ancestors for mankind? And an answer for somebody like William Lane Craig is like, you know what, we don't even have enough scientific evidence to prove that those are ancestors. But for all what we know, those could be creatures, and they could be intelligent, because intelligence is not only limited to mankind, because as far as we can tell, even animals have some sort of intelligence. But those could be creatures that were created by God for whatever reason, and they were extinct before the beginning of biblical mankind. So mankind, as we know it from the Bible, started 10,000 years ago, because that's the biblical account that we have. What is prior to that could be biologically related, but it's not the mankind that God created instantaneously like that. And from this, the relationship started. So William Lane Craig would be somewhere in the middle. But where do I conclude this lecture? If you are struggling with the science of evolution, you'll be surprised to find out within the church, and I'm putting the church as the big context, the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant. You will find within the church many professing Christians who are believing Christians, who believe completely in the divinity of Christ. And the way that they interpret Genesis would go from one end to the other. Does that mean that all of them are wrong? Could be. But honestly, I would tell you that I think the text is relatively vague enough to allow these different interpretations. The bottom line, if you are struggling with the whole theory of evolution and having a hard time matching it with your biblical interpretation, I would tell you, go and read these accounts. Read for somebody like William Lane Craig. Read for somebody like, John Walton, who's probably one of the most liberal people who interpret the Genesis account. And you will find that you're in a good company at that point. I don't think we're going to find the answer to that until we meet God in heaven. And you know what? We'll leave it at that. All right? God bless you.